Welcome to my channel. Today, Miss Marple steps into a case where one woman has more alibis than anyone could imagine, but the truth hides in plain sight. Chapter 1. The hydrangeas were in bloom. Day of the murder had begun with nothing more threatening than a drizzle. St. Mildred's annual summer garden competition was in full swing. Despite the persistent English weather, ruffled parasols bloomed like exotic flowers across the vicarage lawn, their owners clutching teacups and murmuring about soil acidity and late frosts. The hydrangeas were particularly fine that year, though Mrs. Weatherby swore her peonies were sabotaged. Miss Marple, seated quietly beneath the edge of a striped canopy, sipped her weak Darjeeling and admired the view. It was not the blossoms that held her attention, nor the lace-frilled competitions, but rather the subtle tangle of social behavior. There were always patterns. One simply had to sit still long enough for them to emerge. The focal point of the afternoon's chatter was, naturally, Mrs. Audrey Lonscombe. Audrey had returned to St. Mildred's only 3 weeks ago. Though she had grown up here, her family home, a once crumbling Georgian manor called the Larches, had been hastily refurbished. Following the passing of her mother, and the newly returned daughter was now its sole mistress. She cut an elegant figure, tall, composed, dressed in tailored navy linen, with a silver fox stole that was surely too warm for the occasion. The widow of a shipping magnate, Audrey Lonscombe possessed that rare combination of fortune and mystery that made the village simultaneously admire and mistrust her. "Oh, she has been everywhere, you know," whispered Mrs. Purring Fitch to Miss Marple, leaning conspiratorially over a Victoria sponge. "Monte Carlo, Madeira, and some terribly modern place in Italy where they serve olives with everything. Imagine." Miss Marple nodded, eyes gently narrowed. "Indeed, travel can broaden the mind, though it has a curious way of unraveling character as well." "Quite so," said Mrs. Purring Fitch, with no idea what that meant. Audrey moved through the garden party like a swan through a millpond, nodding gracefully to neighbors she barely remembered, drawing the attention of every man and half the women. Inspector Denning, normally the picture of provincial restraint, had offered to fetch her tea twice already. Colonel Spence, who hadn't smiled since the war, was now chuckling beside her like an old schoolboy. It was not until the announcement of the best hydrangea cup that the afternoon took its sinister turn. Reverend Milbanks, sweating slightly under his cassock, tapped the microphone stand with unseemly vigor and read out the winner, Mrs. Julia Greaves. There was polite clapping, and Julia, a stout woman with very poor eyesight and a fondness for boiled sweets, began to waddle forward. She never reached the stage. A cry went up from near the croquet lawn. High, shrill, and unmistakably real. It was Millie Braddon, the vicar's niece, white as parchment and pointing a trembling hand toward the rhododendrons. "She's there, behind the shrubs." People turned, gasped, froze. Miss Marple rose with remarkable agility for a woman of her years. Behind the hedge, just out of sight from the tea tables, lay the body of a man, face down in the gravel, one arm flung unnaturally back, and a dark crimson stain pooling around his collar. The distinctive scent of pipe tobacco still hung faintly in the damp air. Within minutes, Inspector Denning had called for constables, and the garden party devolved into a frightened flock of murmurs and misremembered details. Cups were spilled, cakes were abandoned. Mrs. Weatherby fainted theatrically on a lawn chair, but no one caught her. The man was quickly identified as Gerald Hesketh, a solicitor from the neighboring town of Lower Hemsley, a bachelor, middle-aged, known for his reliability, punctuality, and a few whispered certain less savory visits to London clubs. Miss Marple, standing near the hedge, stared not at the body but at the footprints. She bent slightly, as if brushing a crumb from her hem, and noticed a single scuff in the gravel where someone had turned sharply on their heel. Strange to see Mr. Hesketh here, murmured Mrs. Purring Fitch, reappearing at her elbow like a storm cloud of lavender perfume. He wasn't invited, was he? No, Miss Marple replied softly. But then, one rarely crashes a garden party unless one has something to gain, or something to prevent. The police wasted no time. By twilight, the Larches had been visited, statements had been taken, and villagers had been gently discouraged from theorizing that it didn't work. By supper, it was known in the firm, confident way things are always known in small towns, that Mrs. Audrey Lonscombe had argued with Gerald Hesketh just 2 nights before at the Swan's Rest, the local inn, that she had left abruptly, that Gerald had followed her outside, that neither had been seen again until today, she among the guests, he among the rhododendrons. But strangest of all was what came next. Audrey herself offered not one, but 3 separate alibis, one for the evening of the argument, another for the morning Gerald was presumed to have died, and a third for the time the body was discovered. Each was impeccable. Each was confirmed by a different person. And each, somehow, felt perfect. That night, Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window, watching the street lamps flicker through the mist, knitting a stubbornly twisted sock. 3 alibis. She had once known a woman who provided 2 alibis when her husband's canary went missing. It had turned out to be poison in the marmalade. But 3? No one had that many unless they were hiding something. And no one knew that better than Miss Jane Marple. Chapter 2. The Gossip Beneath the Geraniums. By morning, the village of St. Mildred's was less a collection of homes and more a whispering organism of mouths and memories. The murder had struck the community not with violent fear, but with eager anticipation, the sort of anticipation normally reserved for a royal visit or a flood at the vicarage. And in this particular case, there was no need to speculate wildly because everyone already knew what had happened. At least, they thought they did. Gerald Hesketh, solicitor, late of Lower Hemsley, had been murdered behind a hydrangea bush during the summer garden competition, and it was plainly, indisputably, and without a shadow of doubt, the doing of Audrey Lonscombe, that woman, said Mrs. Dunthorpe to her maid while polishing the brass bell-pull in her hall. Has eyes like a shuttered house. You never know what goes on behind them. She was ever so gracious to me. The maid replied cautiously, though she had never been introduced to Audrey and only once seen her exit the butcher's shop without purchasing anything. Yes, well, so was Lucretia Borgia, I imagine, muttered Mrs. Dunthorpe darkly. Down at Prendergast's grocer's, the butcher had already rehearsed his version of the event for 3 different customers, with slight variations each time. In one version, Audrey had dropped her glove mere seconds before the scream. In another, she'd laughed too quickly when someone mentioned Mr. Hesketh's name. Mr. Prendergast didn't much care which version stuck, so long as people kept buying extra ham out of nervous appetite. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took no part in the gossip. She merely walked through the village that morning, a folded paper in her basket, and stopped now and then to greet those who met her eye. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. People talked when they thought you were harmless. Such a terrible thing, said Miss Chudla outside the post office, clutching a dog lead attached to no dog. I dare say it's the worst we've had since Major Harker fell into his own well. Poor Gerald. He looked positively green when I last saw him. But then again, that might have been the custard at the Swan's Rest. Miss Marple offered a soft, "Oh dear," and continued. At the edge of the green, near the bus stop, she paused before a small gathering of church ladies. She's a widow twice over, said Mrs. Vale, her knitting needles clacking furiously. Did you know? Her first husband died in an avalanche. In Switzerland, of all places. How dramatic, murmured another. And how convenient. Miss Marple tucked the comment away like a button into her memory. Not for the suspicion, but for the tone. Villages, she had often said, were not made up of people, but of dynamics. Secrets aged like pickles in St. Mildred's, and bitterness was often disguised as concern. Audrey Lonscombe, for her part, remained impressively composed. She had given her statement to the constables without the least flutter of indignation. Indeed, she seemed almost amused by the fuss, as if it were a parlor game being played by less sophisticated minds. Her 3 alibis delivered with clarity, each corroborated by distinct witnesses, confused even Inspector Denning, who had expected something less. Airtight. Alibi 1. The evening of the argument, Audrey had been at the book club hosted by Mrs. Trent, where the ladies had spent 2 hours disagreeing about The Woman in White and eating slices of seed cake. Mrs. Trent remembered distinctly, as Audrey had made a dry remark about Marion Halcombe's eyebrows. Alibi 2. The morning of the presumed time of death, Audrey had been at the chemist's with her companion, Miss Lydia Park, purchasing camphor oil and throat lozenges. The chemist confirmed this, with the added detail that she had smelled faintly of lavender and worn gloves of soft gray kid. Alibi 3. The moment Gerald's body was discovered, she had been by the jam tent, speaking with young Christopher Vale about the merits of gooseberry preserves. He recalled her pointing out that the winning entry had been slightly overboiled. 3 clean statements, Inspector Denning told Miss Marple later that day, rubbing the back of his neck. 3 clean confirmations. But I don't like it. I never like it when things line up so neatly, Miss Marple agreed, but only with a mild hum. She was far more interested in the undercurrents that never made it into statements. That evening, Miss Marple invited Reverend Milbanks to tea. She made a point of selecting the china with the faded violets his favorite, and serving her special brown bread with orange marmalade, knowing full well the vicar could never resist either. "Oh dear," said Reverend Milbanks, halfway through his second slice, "I do wish it hadn't happened here. The church garden, Jane. Gerald Hesketh may not have been a saint, but the croquet lawn is hardly the place for a man to be found dead. It upsets the rhythm of things." "Quite," Miss Marple said. "And do you believe Audrey Lonscombe killed him?" The vicar blinked, taken aback. "My dear, I don't believe anything. I observe, I worry, I counsel, but I do not believe. I doubt. And what do you doubt? That such a clever woman would do something so unsubtle as to kill a man, where a niece might stumble upon the body mid-hydrangea inspection." Miss Marple smiled to herself. The Reverend, for all his dithering, saw the edges of things. The next day, Inspector Denning paid another visit to Audrey at the Larches. He returned with more questions than answers. She had offered tea, answered everything with polite precision, and even provided character references from her late husband's estate lawyer in London, and a countess she once accompanied to Lisbon. "Most obliging," Denning muttered afterward. "Far too obliging," and so the case, already fogged by alibis and social flourishes, grew heavier with confusion. By week's end, no one had been arrested. The village was still whispering, the police still circling, and Audrey Lonscombe still appearing at every public event with calm, elegant grace as though daring them to try harder. But Miss Marple had noticed something. Something not in the alibis, not in the gossip, not even in the crime itself. It was in the way Audrey handled a particular teacup. An old habit. A nervous one, and old habits, Miss Marple knew, were far more trustworthy than statements, or jam, or even camphor oil. She resumed her knitting that evening, eyes narrowing over the dropped stitch she had noticed only now. There had been 3 alibis. Yes, but one of them, she was certain, had been too conveniently witnessed. And when people work that hard to be seen, it is often to ensure they are not looked at too closely. Chapter 3. A knitting needle points north. The following Thursday found St. Mildred's wrapped in a warm, sleepy hush. Rain clouds clung to the rooftops, and the streets were glazed in that soft, silvery damp that made the hedgerows glisten and the chimney smoke curl lazily upward. But even in the quiet, there was an undercurrent of watching behind net curtains. From the post office queue, beneath tilted umbrellas in the high street, murder had a way of sharpening attention. And yet, in the center of this quietly humming curiosity, Miss Marple remained as tranquil as ever, sitting in her favorite drawing-room chair with a shawl about her shoulders and a half-completed sock dangling from her needles. But her mind was not tranquil. She was thinking about gloves, gray kid gloves. To be precise, you understand, of course, she had said to her nephew Raymond over the telephone that morning, that gloves are never just gloves. They are declarations, especially when worn by women who know how they are perceived. Raymond, used as such pronouncements, had offered a bemused quite at Jane before returning to his novel in Hampstead. But to Miss Marple, the detail had lodged in her thoughts like a needle's point. Audrey Lonscombe's gloves, always worn, always immaculate, were not fashion. They were armor, and people who wore armor were usually hiding bruises, figuratively or otherwise. After tea, she visited the Swan's Rest. Not for sherry, not even for the fruit tart she pretended to admire, but because of Mrs. Palmer. Mrs. Palmer was the innkeeper's wife, and more importantly, she was the most overlooked listener in St. Mildred's, not by choice, perhaps, but people spoke freely round her, assuming she hadn't the memory to retain what was said, nor the boldness to repeat it. Both assumptions were false. "Oh, Miss Marple," she chirped as Jane entered, wiping her hands on her apron. "Such dreadful weather, isn't it?" "Yes, though I find rain brings clarity," said Miss Marple, settling onto a cushioned bench near the window. "Have you been terribly busy with all the police coming through?" Mrs. Palmer sighed, in the melodramatic fashion of one who has been burdened, but secretly enjoyed it. "They've asked 1,000 questions, poor loves, sat right over there with their notebooks and their boots leaving marks on my tiles. But I told them all I knew. I said, Audrey Lonscombe came in with Mr. Hesketh on Wednesday night, sat near the fire, argued about something fierce." She paused. "Of course, I didn't say argue, not to the police. Said they debated something. Sounds less well deadly. What time did they leave?" Miss Marple asked gently, stirring a teaspoon, though she hadn't been served anything yet. "8:15. I remember because the clock chimed just after they walked out. Funny thing, though, yes, I could have sworn Audrey came back in, just for a moment, alone, but it might have been someone else. Hard to say with that great big coat and hat she wears." Miss Marple's knitting fingers twitched. Not for the first time, a timeline had blurred at its edges. "Thank you, dear," she said, rising slowly. "You've been most helpful. The tart looks lovely, by the way." She left without tasting it. That evening, she sat by her fireplace, reviewing what she had gathered. 3 alibis. One rooted in social performance, the book club. One in habitual routine, the chemist. And one in proximity to the crime, the jam tent. The jam tent was the weakest. It relied not on time, but on sight. Anyone could appear calm and unbloodied 10 feet away from a murder scene. It was the chemistry of the alibis that interested Miss Marple, how they sat together. And they did not sit comfortably at all. In the village, Inspector Denning was growing uneasy. 3 alibis, and yet every time I speak to her, I feel like I'm the one being interviewed, he told his sergeant. "There's no motive anyone will speak of, but you can feel the tension, can't you?" He'd been reviewing Gerald Hesketh's case files and letters. A man who had no debts, no known enemies, and no known romantic entanglements, except a certain note found in his pocket had given him pause. Written in green ink on monogrammed paper, "We cannot speak here. Meet me at the edge of the vicarage garden, dusk. Come alone," unsigned. but the paper was traced to a stationery set sold only at Hargrave's of Mayfair, a set identical to the one found in Audrey Lonscombe's writing desk during a routine property search. It wasn't enough to convict, but it was enough to doubt. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple reread a letter from her late friend Beatrice Graham, a letter penned years earlier about Audrey's first marriage. Audrey had a way of making others speak and herself disappear. The perfect guest, but never quite present. I always wondered what she saw when she looked at people, not affection, but strategy, perhaps. That was what it was, not the presence of guilt, but the performance of innocence. Later that week, a small discovery brought things into sharper relief. Miss Lydia Park, Audrey's companion, visited Miss Marple to return a borrowed embroidery pattern. Lydia was a shy, moth-like woman with long fingers and the nervous habit of wiping non-existent dust from her lap. Mrs. Lonscombe has been quite distraught. Of course, she said, but terribly composed for the police. I do hope none of this troubles her standing with the church ladies. Quite, Miss Marple replied, pouring out tea. And to think she had such a headache that morning, Lydia continued absently. She rarely takes anything for it, but that day she insisted on camphor. Said she'd been seen at the chemist, so might as well make the purchase worthwhile. Miss Marple's hand paused mid-pour. Been seen? Lydia flushed slightly. Oh dear. I shouldn't have said that, should I? Not at all, Miss Marple said kindly. It's just that being seen is such an interesting objective for someone with a headache. As Lydia fidgeted with her gloves and changed the subject, Miss Marple turned the phrase over in her mind that it confirmed what she already suspected. Audrey Lonscombe had not constructed alibis for innocence. She had constructed witnesses for perception, which meant the real question was not whether she was guilty of murder, but whether she was guilty of the right one, because Miss Marple, with her knitting and her quiet inquiries, was beginning to suspect that Gerald Hesketh's death was only the tip of something older. Something planned with gloves on, and it would not be the first time in St. Mildred's that the truth had worn perfume. Chapter 4. The face in the frame. The first suspect emerged, as they so often do in small villages, not from the facts but from the murmurs between them. It began with a framed photograph. Miss Marple was visiting the church hall on Saturday morning for the Women's Fellowship bake sale. She had contributed her cherry scones, neatly arranged on a blue and white platter. The rain had paused, and the sun filtered gently through the stained glass windows, catching on the teacups and silver serving tongs. It was, for a moment, perfectly ordinary, until she noticed the frame. It was sitting, unassumingly, on the corner of a trestle table near the raffle tickets. Inside was a faded photograph of 3 people, 2 men and a woman smiling in the blurry, sepia-tinted confidence of the 1930s. The men were both in cricket whites. The woman wore a cloaky hat and held a parasol at an angle so distinctive it might as well have been a signature. Audrey Lonscombe, younger, yes, but unmistakable. Miss Marple leaned closer. One of the men had a slightly crooked smile, and his hand rested on Audrey's shoulder, not possessive, but familiar. The other stood a step behind, his eyes averted and his posture formal. Well now, that's a memory, came a voice behind her. It was George Edison, once captain of the St. Mildred's cricket team and now owner of a window repair business. That was more talk than work. That was the summer tournament of '38, he said with a nostalgic sigh. Before everything changed, of course, before the war, said Miss Marple quietly, and before Audrey married that shipping fellow. The chap on the left was Frank Meller, dead now. Pneumonia, they said, but it always sounded odd to me. The one on the right, well, that's Arnold Price, the same Arnold Price who owns the antique shop. The very same, George nodded. Lived in London for years, then came back to St. Mildred's when his sister died. Keeps to himself mostly. Used to be quite taken with Audrey, if you believe the whispers. Miss Marple did. She always did. Later that afternoon, she wandered into the antique shop under the pretense of finding a replacement lid for a teapot. Arnold Price was there, as he always was, wearing a vest with silver buttons and spectacles that made his eyes look perpetually surprised. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a polite smile. "How can I assist today?" "I was admiring a photograph this morning at the bake sale," she said gently. "One from the summer of 1938. You were in it, I believe." He stiffened slightly. "Yes, that photograph turns up now and again. George Edison likes to trot it out when nostalgia suits him. She was quite striking, even then." A pause. "Yes, Audrey has always been." Composed Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Did you see her the day Gerald Hesketh died?" Arnold looked directly at her for the first time. "No. I haven't spoken to Audrey in nearly 15 years. Not since she left St. Mildred's the first time. We were close once, but life separated us. And Mr. Hesketh? I hardly knew him," Arnold said. "I believe he once inquired about an old writing desk, but we didn't do business. He wasn't the type. Discreet." Miss Marple's knitting bag swung lightly as she turned. "Do forgive me for prying, Mr. Price. You understand, of course, that discretion is sometimes the mask of deeper things." He didn't respond, but she noticed his hands were trembling slightly as he adjusted a clock on the counter. That evening, in the privacy of her cottage, Miss Marple stitched together what she had seen. Arnold Price, reserved, solitary, unfailingly courteous, had once been part of Audrey's past. A quiet figure in a photograph, a forgotten corner of the village, a man who had watched from the edges, and now, suddenly, he was emerging, not loudly, not guiltily, but like a note from a piano long out of tune. Meanwhile, the official investigation had locked onto another name entirely. Lydia Park. It began with a small inconsistency in her statement. Miss Park had said she accompanied Audrey to the chemist's on the morning of the murder, but when questioned again, she hesitated when asked the time. Was it before or after 11? Inspector Denning asked. "Before, I think," Lydia replied. "Or was it after?" He pressed. "I'm certain it was before, but the chemist's log showed a transaction camphor oil and lozenges at 11:52 a.m. Paid in coin." The discrepancy was not damning, but it was enough. The police gently invited Lydia for questioning at the station, and she went quietly, her coat buttoned all the way to her neck and her hands tucked inside woolen gloves. Despite the mild air, she returned home 3 hours later, pale and shaken, words spread like ivy on stone. "She's the one," whispered Mrs. Vale to the vicar over carrot sandwiches, always skulking about like a shadow. "You can't trust a woman who doesn't raise her voice." At the Larches, Audrey received the news of her companion's questioning with a faint smile. "Poor Lydia," she murmured. "She's always been so nervous. I suppose the pressure got to her. She's a loyal friend," said Inspector Denning, watching her carefully. "Oh yes," Audrey replied, brushing a fleck of dust from her cuff. "Almost too loyal." But Miss Marple saw the timing differently. It was far too early for the true culprit to be exposed. When people rushed to a suspect, especially one so visibly fragile, it was usually because the real answer remained elusive and dangerously clever. She considered the possible motives. Was it blackmail? Romance gone wrong? Old scandal? Or was it something older, more buried, something connected to the village itself, to the people who never left and the ones who returned with polished shoes and secrets behind their smiles? Audrey had many alibis, and now she had a distraction. Lydia was a perfect shield. But what, Miss Marple wondered, would happen if the shield cracked, and who would tremble most when it did? She looked again at the photograph from 1938. which she had borrowed from George Edison under the pretense of preserving it in plastic wrap. 3 people. 1 missing, 1 hiding. And 1 smiling to precisely. The past, she knew, rarely stayed buried for long. Not in St. Mildred's, and certainly not when Audrey Lonscombe was involved. Chapter 5. The Thread in the Hem. The following Monday brought with it the first real sun in days. St. Mildred's glistened, the hedges newly trimmed, and the stone paths dried to a warm gray. It might have been any ordinary week save for the persistent tension that hung in the village air. Like a hymn sung slightly off-key, Miss Marple spent her morning as she always did, tending to her small garden with quiet, deliberate care. But beneath her sun hat and beside the trowel, her mind whirred. Something small and out of place was bothering her. It had to do with fabric, not clothing, not gloves, not a garment one wore, but something decorative. A curtain. No, not quite. A hem. It came back to her suddenly, sharp as a dropped stitch snapping tight. The memory of Audrey Lonscombe walking away from the jam. 10th, the day of the garden party. Miss Marple had been admiring a particularly strong entry in the lemon curd category. When Audrey passed behind her, what struck her at the time was the bold red trim on the inside lining of her jacket visible only when she moved quickly and the coat flared outward. Such a specific, rich color, almost theatrical, but it hadn't matched. Not with the soft, tasteful tones Audrey was known for. Miss Marple went to her desk that morning and made a note. Red lining, seen before 3:45 p.m. That was before the body was discovered, before the scream, before Audrey had been noticed at the jam tent. And yet, in her police statement, Audrey had claimed to be there at the time of discovery, speaking with Christopher Vale about preserves. He had confirmed it, but if her coat had been seen minutes before, walking in the opposite direction, Miss Marple retrieved her gardening gloves and headed toward the larches. Audrey received her with cool politeness, offering tea on the veranda. She wore an elegant cream blouse, a brooch shaped like a swallow, and a pair of rose-tinted spectacles that gave her an air of detachment, as though observing life through a pane of colored glass. "How lovely to see you, Miss Marple," she said with a faint smile. "Do sit. I was just reading about the Bishop of Ely's latest remarks on cultural decay. It's always rather comforting when clergy say exactly what one expects, don't you think?" "Quite," Miss Marple said, settling herself with a smile. So reassuring when people remain predictable. There was a pause long enough to suggest courtesy, not intimacy. "I couldn't help but admire the coat you wore at the garden party," Miss Marple said lightly. The red lining was such a bold touch. Audrey blinked. "Red lining? No, dear, I believe you're mistaken. I wore a blue silk jacket with dove gray lining. I never wear red." Too vulgar. Miss Marple sipped her tea, then tilted her head thoughtfully. "Of course. Perhaps the light caught it strangely. Or perhaps I confused you with someone else." There was the faintest shift behind Audrey's smile. Not quite fierce, something more subtle. A recalibration. They continued on to harmless subjects: rhododendrons, postmen, the rising cost of clotted cream, and parted on good terms. But Miss Marple's certainty had only strengthened. Someone had worn Audrey's coat that afternoon. Someone of similar build, similar height. Someone able to be seen where Audrey needed to not be. And if the lining had truly been red, then the coat had not belonged to Audrey at all. That it was an illusion, a borrowed shadow. That evening, Miss Marple visited Christopher Vale, the young man who had spoken with Audrey at the jam tent. He was the vicar's nephew, in his mid-20s, with the sort of clean, open face that looked permanently apologetic. He answered the door still wearing gardening gloves and smelling faintly of peat. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, "do come in. You've just missed my aunt, but I've got some lemon biscuits left. They're quite dry, but well, they exist." She declined the biscuit, but accepted a seat on the front step. "I wanted to ask about the garden party," she said gently. "You spoke to Mrs. Lonscombe at the jam tent, didn't you?" "Oh yes, she was terribly interested in my gooseberry entry. Said it had too much pectin, but admirable acidity. Was she wearing anything distinctive?" Christopher blinked. I think so. A coat, maybe. Light blue. She wore gloves, too, though she took one off to try a spoonful. I remember her nails. Very neat." Miss Marple hesitated. "Do you recall her brooch?" "Oh, yes," he said brightly. "A swallow. I remember, because I have one just like it carved into the stone bench in the vicar's garden. She said it was a favorite of hers." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, idle curiosity. I always admire when people wear birds. So revealing, don't you think? A swallow implies grace. A magpie? Mischief?" Christopher looked baffled. "I suppose so." Later, as she walked home beneath a rising moon, Miss Marple considered what she had learned. The swallow brooch had been on Audrey at both appearances, which meant either the coat had been switched later or the person impersonating her had been lent the brooch as well. That was trust, more than trust, collusion. Someone had assisted Audrey in constructing one of her alibis, and Miss Marple had a growing suspicion as to who did at dawn. She penned a letter to Inspector Denning requesting a quiet interview with Miss Lydia Park. They met in the reading room of the village library, its shelves thick with dust and the scent of old bindings. Lydia arrived promptly, hands folded, eyes downcast. Miss Marple, without preamble, said, "Dear, do you recall the afternoon of the garden party? Did you lend Audrey your coat?" Lydia flinched. I don't." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on hers. "It isn't a crime to protect a friend, but it is dangerous to help them construct a lie around a death." Lydia's eyes brimmed, and her voice came out in a whisper. "She asked me just before the guests arrived. Said she didn't feel well and might slip away early. She told me to walk about a bit in her coat, say a few things loudly by the jam tent so she'd be remembered being there. I thought it was harmless." "Did she mention Gerald Hesketh?" "No, only that she couldn't face seeing someone, that she needed air." Miss Marple pressed gently. "And the brooch? She gave it to me, said it would make the illusion perfect." Lydia broke down then, quietly but completely. Miss Marple said nothing. She didn't need to. It was not proof, not yet, but it was the hidden clue she had been waiting for. The kind that, once noticed, unraveled the stitching of the lie. A coat worn by another. A brooch passed between hands. An alibi manufactured, not lived. Audrey Lonscombe had not only predicted the murder's timing, she had prepared for it. And soon, Miss Marple thought, she would see what else had been stitched into the hem of this quiet little crime. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The days that followed in St. Mildred's were deceptively calm. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains of cottages left ajar. Bees hummed in lazy spirals around honeysuckle vines. Children skipped rope outside the greengrocer's. But beneath the sunlit charm, something had shifted. The villagers no longer whispered so casually about Lydia Park, nor so confidently about Audrey Lonscombe's innocence. The tale of the borrowed coat, while not publicly acknowledged, had found its way into the unspoken knowledge of the town, into the glance between shopkeepers, the hesitant pause before greetings, the wary tone in farewell. And Miss Marple knew the net was beginning to tighten. But there was one knot she hadn't quite undone. Gerald Hesketh. For all the discussion about Audrey's movements, Lydia's participation, and Arnold Price's past, Gerald himself remained a shadow struck down before anyone had a chance to understand why he'd come to St. Mildred's. In the first place, that changed on Wednesday afternoon. Miss Marple received a visitor. Arnold Price. He appeared at her door, precisely at 3 o'clock, hat in hand, the lines on his face drawn tighter than she had ever seen. "May I speak with you, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice formal, but there was something beneath it, a kind of weariness, as if a wall he had built decades ago had finally begun to crumble. She led him to the sitting room and poured 2 cups of tea. No lemon, no questions. He spoke slowly. "I knew Gerald Hesketh." She looked up gently, but said nothing. "Not well, but enough. We crossed paths during my time in London. We had mutual acquaintances in the auction world. He was clever to clever, the kind of man who knew the worth of silence. Were you friends?" Arnold laughed bitterly. "No, but we had history." He hesitated. "It was Audrey," he said finally. "Everything returns to her, doesn't it?" Miss Marple inclined her head. Arnold stared into his tea. "Gerald courted her once, before she married Richard Lonscombe. He was older, less wealthy but persistent, and very much in love, I believe. Audrey turned him down, of course, then vanished into society. But Gerald, he never quite let it go. Was he resentful? I don't know if that's the right word. Curious, maybe. He wanted something from her, perhaps just the satisfaction of being remembered." He paused again. "Last month, I received a letter from Gerald. Said he would be in St. Mildred's, that he intended to speak with Audrey, that he had information she would do well to reckon with." Miss Marple set her teacup down softly. "Blackmail?" she asked. Arnold shook his head. "Not in the crude sense. Gerald liked to unsettle. He took pleasure in exposing facades. And what facade was he threatening to expose?" Arnold looked at her, then truly looked. "I believe he knew something about her first husband, about Richard Lonscombe's death. It was reported as a drowning off the Amalfi coast, a boating accident. But I recall Gerald hinting, years ago, that there was more to it, that Richard had changed his will shortly before the trip, that Audrey came back wealthier than expected." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "So Gerald came to St. Mildred's not to catch up, but to confront her." Arnold nodded. "And now he's dead." Miss Marple visited Inspector Denning that evening. He was seated at his desk in the station, brow furrowed, scribbling over timelines for the 3rd time that week. "Miss Marple," he said, setting down his pen, "I imagine you've come with another of your, how shall I say, harmlessly devastating observations." She smiled. "I merely wondered if Gerald Hesketh's possessions had been examined fully. Of course, nothing suspicious. A train ticket, a monogrammed handkerchief, a small pocketbook. No letters?" "No." She tilted her head. "Would it be possible he posted one before his death?" Denning narrowed his eyes. "You think he mailed something in St. Mildred's?" "I think a man with a threat to deliver and limited time might choose the post over confrontation." That evening, Denning dispatched a constable to inquire at the post office. Sure enough, Mrs. Mallory, the postmistress, recalled a tall man with a sharp mustache posting a small envelope the morning before the garden party, paid in exact coin, no return address, and one envelope matching that description had indeed been sent to a solicitor's office in London. Under discreet pressure, the firm revealed the envelope contained a single page. Gerald Hesketh's written intention to confront Audrey Lonscombe about details surrounding the unexpected will change of Richard Lonscombe and the potential for reopening the case. The letter had arrived after Gerald's death. Its contents were now with the police. Miss Marple received the news with quiet satisfaction. The motive, long suspected, had stepped from shadow into certainty. But the truth was not yet complete. She called on Audrey the next day. The Larches was as impeccable as ever, polished stair rails, symmetrical flower beds, a faint trace of lilac oil in the hall. Audrey sat beside the piano, one long hand trailing over the keys. She did not rise. "I imagine you didn't come for music," she said. "No," Miss Marple said gently. "I came for honesty." Audrey laughed. "A rare commodity." Miss Marple studied her. "Gerald Hesketh came to confront you. About Richard. About a will, I see, Audrey said. Her tone was airy, but her fingers curled slightly against the piano. You had time to stop him, and you constructed a set of alibis so meticulous they nearly shimmered. Nearly, Audrey echoed. And yet, here you are. Did you kill him yourself? Audrey turned to the window. No, but I arranged for the opportunity. And Lydia? She did nothing, only walked about in my coat like a loyal pet. Audrey smiled faintly. She would never ask why. That's her gift. Miss Marple leaned forward. You've always been clever, Audrey, but cleverness doesn't change the truth. Audrey rose slowly, gracefully. No, Miss Marple. But sometimes, truth needs assistance finding the right audience. Miss Marple left the Larches with the knowledge she had expected and feared. Audrey had not needed to strike the blow. She had only needed to ensure the right man stood in the right place at the right time. A shove, a fall, a stone dot. It was also simple. She returned to her cottage and folded the photograph from 1938 into a drawer. 3 people, only one still smiling, and that smile, she now understood, had always been a mask. Chapter 7. The fire behind the Famibi. Friday morning. The summer air had grown heavy with the threat of a storm. Thunderheads loomed beyond the hills like judgment waiting to be passed, and the birds flew lower than usual, as if uncertain of the sky. In St. Mildred's, however, the mood was not one of weather but of watchfulness. Miss Marple had spent the better part of the morning tending to her roses, clipping dead heads and carefully lifting each leaf to inspect for disease. Her face remained calm, but her mind had been troubled since her last visit to the Larches. Audrey's words, so elegant, so unapologetically poised, had hinted at something cold and final. It was the tone of someone who no longer feared consequence, and Miss Marple knew from experience, when someone no longer feared consequences, they had nothing left to protect, or no one. She wasn't the only one unsettled dot at the police station. Inspector Denning was pacing. The letter Gerald Hesketh posted proves motive. Yes, he muttered to his sergeant, but not action. If we charge her now, she'll claim coincidence. Yes, he threatened me, and then someone else conveniently killed him. She'll make it sound like theater. Then what do we do? The sergeant asked. Denning hesitated, his jaw tightening. We wait, we watch, we dig. The next shift in the case came strangely enough from a chimney. It was Arnold Price who discovered it. He had finally decided, after a week of disrupted sleep and frayed nerves, to remove the old photographs from his mantelpiece and burn a few of the more painful memories. He selected 3, one of himself and Audrey in their youth, one of Gerald Hesketh raising a toast at a London party, and one of the 3 of them at Brighton, smiles sun-drenched and artificial. He fed them to the grate just after dusk, watching the flames curl the corners like parchment. But it was the photograph frame that caught his attention. It had been a gift from Audrey, decades ago, brass etched with birds and ivy. As he handled it, he felt something shift, a faint rattle between the glass and the backing. He pried the frame open. Inside, tucked behind the photograph, was a folded envelope, sealed and forgotten, Arnold's. Hands trembled. The envelope was addressed to him. In Gerald Hesketh's handwriting. He brought it to Miss Marple. Before even opening it, I don't trust myself to read it first, he confessed. If it says what I think it says. Miss Marple accepted it without a word. She opened the flap carefully and unfolded the note within. It was short, direct. Arnold, if anything happens to me before I confront Audrey, know this. I have proof. The solicitor in London has the revised copy of Richard's will. I suspect she forged it. If I die, it wasn't misfortune. Miss Marple set it down, her expression unreadable. Arnold sank into her armchair, visibly older by the minute. I loved her, Miss Marple, even now. Even after all this, some part of me wanted to believe she was simply a woman of bad luck, not bad intent. Affection, Miss Marple said softly, is a wonderful thing, but it is not the same as blindness. Arnold looked up. Do we bring this to Denning? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, but carefully. This is no longer about suspicion. It's about clarity. Inspector Denning received the note with grim satisfaction. Now we have motive and evidence of intent, he said. If Audrey's fingerprints are on the revised will, we can confirm forgery. But it's still not quite enough. It proves she had something to lose, but not that she killed him. Miss Marple raised a brow. Then perhaps it's time to consider who else had something to lose. That evening, as the storm finally broke over St. Mildred's and the rain slashed down the window panes, Miss Marple sat in her drawing room with Lydia Park. The younger woman looked pale and hollow, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never quite drank. I was a fool, she whispered. No, Miss Marple replied. You were lonely. Lydia's lips quivered. She promised she'd take me with her. After it all blew over, she said we'd leave together, go to the coast, start fresh. She used you. Lydia gave a broken laugh. Of course she did. But I let her. Miss Marple hesitated. Lydia, was Audrey alone that day? Truly, all the way through? Lydia looked at her, eyes suddenly sharp. She told me not to ask. Then I must. For a long moment, Lydia was silent. Then there was a man. He came to the Larches the night before. I didn't see his face. He was gone by morning. Did she seem frightened? No, she seemed triumphant. The next morning, Miss Marple made one last visit to the vicarage. The Reverend Milbanks, still in his dressing gown and slippers, looked startled to see her on his doorstep. My dear Jane, what brings you out in this weather? I need your help, she said, and I need a box of old parish records. He blinked. Parish records? From the summer of 1938. It took nearly 2 hours. But together they unearthed what she needed, a ledger of marriage banns, faded and watermarked, but still legible. And there it was. Arnold Price, Audrey Chiltern, notice filed, July 12th. Withdrawn, August 1. Miss Marple traced her finger under the line. She was meant to marry Arnold before she met Richard Lonscombe. Milbanks frowned. But she left so suddenly that year. It caused quite a stir. She left after receiving an inheritance, Miss Marple said quietly. A small one. From an aunt. Just enough, I imagine, to afford her passage to the circles where Richard Lonscombe moved. And the engagement. She ended it. Coldly, I suspect. And perhaps Arnold forgave her. But Gerald didn't. She stood slowly, holding the ledger to her chest. This murder isn't only about money or betrayal. What is it about then? Pride, old wounds, a performance polished over decades. But the thread has frayed. She left the vicarage as the sun began to push through the clouds again. Her shoes soaked, her resolve unshaken. Audrey had orchestrated many things, but the one thing she had not expected was someone remembering everything. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test. The next day dawned unnaturally still. No breeze stirred the curtains in Miss Marple's drawing room. No sparrow chirped at the window panes. The village, perhaps sensing the approach of a truth too long delayed, had fallen into a kind of hushed anticipation. Miss Marple, ever precise, laid out her morning with care, a fresh blouse, her softest cardigan. She prepared tea, weak and unassuming. Then she placed a single object on the doily-covered table, a silver thimble, not because it was relevant to the crime, but because it was comforting. She would face a woman of sharp intelligence today, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that the best way to disarm the clever was not with confrontation, but with a kindness that confused them. At precisely 10 o'clock, Audrey Lonscombe arrived. She had come alone. She wore dove gray against smooth wool, perfectly pressed, and a hat tilted at the exact angle to suggest dignity. not morning. Her brooch, as always, was the swallow. "You asked to see me," Audrey said, stepping into the parlor with the air of someone expecting either a compliment or an ambush. "Yes, dear," Miss Marple said cheerily. "Do sit down. Tea?" "No, thank you." Audrey's tone was velvet over ice. "I'd appreciate it if we could be brief. I'm due in Lower Hemsley by noon." Miss Marple smiled, poured herself a cup, and stirred it thoughtfully. She did not speak at first. Audrey waited, not fidgeting, never fidgeting, but poised like a sculpture that might choose to speak. "I was thinking about coats," Miss Marple said at last. "Such personal things. They carry more of us than we realize. Odors, threads, habits. Don't you think?" Audrey blinked slowly. "I suppose. Is that why you summoned me?" Miss Marple's smile deepened. "No, my dear. I summoned you because I thought you might want the chance to explain yourself before someone else does." A long silence followed. Then Audrey gave a short, dry laugh. "I do admire your nerve, Miss Marple, but unless you've brought the police, I'm afraid I'm late." She stood. "I know Gerald came to confront you," Miss Marple said gently, "about your first husband, about the will. I know you intercepted him perhaps before he reached your door, perhaps on the path behind the garden. I know you constructed a false presence at the jam tent using Lydia, wearing your coat and your brooch. Clever, really. And I know that Gerald never made it to that confrontation because he was already dead by then." Audrey's hand froze on her handbag. "What you don't know," Miss Marple continued, "is that someone else, someone who still believed in you, has provided your final alibi." Audrey's face tightened. "I don't need an alibi, but you used one," Miss Marple said. "And that is what gave you away. It was too clean, too arranged. Alibis, you see, are like embroidery. When they're too perfect, they don't look handmade anymore." Audrey remained standing. Her fingers drummed once lightly on the edge of the teacup saucer before pulling back. "You have no proof. I have a letter," Miss Marple said calmly, "written by Gerald, sent before the party. In it, he said if anything happened to him, you were responsible." Audrey's breath caught barely, but Miss Marple saw it. "That letter," she went on, "was hidden behind a photograph frame in Arnold Price's house. He only just discovered it, and you believe Arnold?" Audrey scoffed. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "I believe Arnold wanted very much to keep loving you, but he also wanted to sleep again." Audrey's shoulders slowly lowered. Her chin lifted. "What now?" "That depends on you," Miss Marple replied. "You could confess, quietly, or you could let the police reach you first. They're only a day or two behind." Audrey looked out the window. "I never meant for it to happen there, in that place. I thought I'd confront him quietly, send him off. But Gerald wasn't the sort to be dismissed." "No," Miss Marple said. "He never was." Audrey turned back. Her voice, when it came, was unexpectedly small. "I didn't push him, you know. He slipped." He was angry, red in the face, raising his voice. "We were arguing by the edge of the croquet slope. He turned, lost his footing, fell badly. I looked down at him and knew he was dead. Just like that, and you walked away. What would you have done?" Audrey snapped. "I had everything to lose." Miss Marple regarded her calmly. "I would have told the truth." "You can say that," Audrey hissed, "because no one has ever wanted to ruin you." Another silence. Then, at last, Audrey sat. She took off her gloves slowly, placed them on her lap. "I suppose this is what it feels like," she murmured. "What is?" "The end of control." Miss Marple rose, walked to the mantel, and adjusted the thimble. "Not quite, dear, but close." 2 days later, Audrey Lonscombe was taken into custody. The official charge was obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal the truth surrounding Gerald Hesketh's death. The forensic report listed the death as a fall, but the Crown would pursue a manslaughter charge based on Premeditation and willful manipulation of witnesses. Arnold Price never spoke publicly again. He closed the antique shop and moved to a smaller village near the coast. Whether to forget or remember in peace, no one could say. Lydia Park was offered kindness by the community in small, awkward ways: extra jam at the grocer's, warm scones left at her doorstep, and invitations to tea she once would have found too intimidating to accept. She began to read more novels, then philosophy, and one day, quite suddenly, stopped wearing gloves. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her garden. She clipped her roses and mended a hem and received a thank you letter from Inspector Denning on tasteful stationery. Inside was a single line: "How did you know to ask about the coat?" She smiled, folded the note, and tucked it behind the thimble on her mantel, because, of course, it had never been just about the coat. It had been about the performance, and Miss Marple, gentle and unassuming, had simply refused to clap. Chapter 9. The Truth in the Garden. The village of St. Mildred's, in the wake of Audrey Lonscombe's arrest, seemed to breathe again. Not loudly, not brazenly, but with the quiet exhale of a place that had survived something it didn't quite know how to name. The hedges still grew, the baker still sold crumpets at 6 pence, and the postmistress still opened her shutters with military precision. But people spoke more gently now, eyes met with greater care, and gossip, once the currency of daily life, had acquired the aftertaste of guilt. Miss Marple did not join in. She sat on the bench near the croquet lawn where Gerald Hesketh's body had been found, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. The garden had been restored, the blood washed away long ago by English rain. The grass receded. The rhododendrons were in full bloom again. She waited. Inspector Denning arrived shortly after noon, his hat tucked under one arm and a sheaf of papers in the other. "You were right about the will," he said as he sat beside her. "Audrey forged it. We confirmed it through handwriting analysis. But the real key was the missing clause, something only Richard Lonscombe's original solicitor remembered drafting. She erased it completely. Was it the inheritance clause?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Yes, it named a nephew as the fallback beneficiary. She removed him entirely." Miss Marple nodded, as if the weather had simply proven mild again. Denning exhaled. "She won't be charged with murder. There's no proof she physically harmed Gerald. But the conspiracy charge will stick, and obstruction. It may be a short sentence, but she'll never wear that mask again." They sat in silence. Then Denning added, "The prosecutor was especially interested in Lydia Park, not for punishment, but for testimony. Her statement was measured, detailed, without embellishment. She'll help put the pieces in place." Miss Marple looked down at her gloves. "She's not as fragile as Audrey thought," she murmured. Denning turned toward her. "How did you know that Audrey was behind it all?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I didn't know," she said. "Not at first. But I watched her." He waited. She was too clean, too perfect. Her alibis came not from natural rhythm, but design. When people lie impulsively, there's always something disjointed, an overlap, a contradiction. But Audrey's lies were rehearsed, coordinated. That's what made them fragile. Denning looked down at the grass and the coat. "Ah," Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling faintly. "That was the beginning. I noticed the red lining. Audrey denied owning a coat with red lining. But I'd seen it myself, which meant someone else had worn it. Lydia, as it turned out. And if a woman goes to the trouble of lending her brooch, her coat, her very presence to another, she's doing more than avoiding suspicion. She's rewriting time." Denning gave a low whistle. "Remarkable." "It wasn't remarkable," Miss Marple said. "It was human. People lie, but only certain people lie so well that they need someone else to speak for them." That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Lydia Park, She stood on the front step with a paper bag in one hand and a nervous smile in the other. "I brought you a honey loaf," she said. "It's store-bought. I'm afraid. It's the thought that counts," Miss Marple replied. Ushering her in, they sat in the sitting room with tea and no need for small talk. Lydia was quieter now, but steadier. "I think I knew," she said after a moment. "Even before Gerald died, I think I knew she would ruin someone someday. I just didn't think it would be me." Miss Marple didn't interrupt. "I used to admire her," Lydia continued. "She made me feel clever by association, as if proximity to brilliance might offer some kind of protection. But it doesn't," Miss Marple said gently. "No." Lydia folded her hands. "It only teaches you how dangerous brilliance can be when it's unkind." They sat in companionable silence for a time. Then Lydia asked, "What will happen to her?" "She'll serve her time. Perhaps not long. But the village has seen her, truly seen her." "That's a different sort of sentence." Lydia looked down at her tea. "And you?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I shall return to my roses and my knitting. There are socks to finish, you know." The last twist came not in a courtroom nor a confession. It came in the form of a letter. A week later, Miss Marple received a parcel from Arnold Price. No return address. Inside was a small, carved box walnut, inlaid with delicate swallows and a note. "Miss Marple, thank you for reminding me that silence can be just as cruel as deceit. I have sold the shop and left St. Mildred's. There are places where memory does not knock so loudly. I hope you'll accept this small gift. Audrey gave it to me when we were young. I no longer wish to keep it." A.P. Miss Marple turned the box over in her hands. It was beautiful, and heavy with regret. She placed it on the mantel beside her thimble. Then, quite suddenly, she stood. She walked out to her garden, bent down to the base of the rosebush beneath her window, and began pruning, one petal at a time. No dramatics. No speeches. Just the quiet, exacting work of pulling back the thorns. Chapter 10. The silence that followed. St. Mildred's changed, but not in ways that visitors would notice. To the outsider, the village remained its picturesque self: tidy hedgerows, orderly chimneys, and shop fronts that still opened promptly at 9. The same names greeted you at the post office, and the bell above the grocer's door still jingled with its familiar brass cheer. But something in the rhythm of the place had softened, grown quieter. Audrey Lonscombe's absence echoed most in the pauses between conversations. No one spoke ill of her. Not openly, but they spoke less. As if the village, once eager to dissect every marriage and marigold, had found itself chastened. They had watched a woman so composed, so poised, orchestrate a lie with such precision that even truth had been made to feel like a poor performance. And in the end, it had taken Miss Marple to remind them that manners were not morality. Audrey served her sentence at a discreet women's facility in Kent. It was not long, just under a year, but long enough for her reputation to settle into memory rather than presence. She sent no letters to the village, nor did she ask Lydia Park to visit. She knew, perhaps, that the silence said enough. Lydia remained in St. Mildred's. She began working part-time at the Vicarage Library, cataloging parish records and assisting with Sunday readings. She walked more often now through lanes she once hurried down, past homes where her name was no longer spoken with pity, but with soft admiration. The villagers, uncertain how to mend their guilt, offered her small kindnesses. Lydia accepted each with quiet grace, never demanding more. Arnold Price was not seen again. Rumor placed him in a cottage by the sea, near a small town, with no antique shop and few questions. Occasionally, a parcel would arrive addressed to the church, a rare hymn book, a pressed wildflower, a tin of French tea. These, Miss Marple suspected, were his way of saying thank you without admitting the weight he still carried. And Miss Marple, she continued as she always had. She clipped her roses, returned library books on time, and won the church's biscuit competition by a modest margin. She never boasted, never lectured. She simply noticed. One morning in late September, Inspector Denning came by the cottage. He stood in the doorway with his hat in hand. More visitor than policeman now. I still find it strange, he said as she poured him tea. All the effort, all the polish, just to keep something hidden that was bound to surface. Miss Marple stirred her tea once. It's rarely about the crime itself, Inspector. It's about what the crime threatens to reveal. Denning leaned back. Audrey was always hiding, wasn't she? Miss Marple nodded. From judgment, from memory, from being ordinary. He took a sip and sighed. I sometimes wonder if Gerald hadn't died, if he'd confronted her publicly, whether she might have collapsed all the same. Not from guilt, but from exposure. Miss Marple set down her cup. She didn't fear prison. She feared being seen. Denning tilted his head. And yet, you saw her all along. No, Miss Marple said gently. I watched her. She showed me the rest herself. He smiled. I suppose that's the difference between us. I ask questions. You wait for answers. She smiled too. Both are needed, but only one leads people to speak. As he left, he paused at the gate. What will you do now, Miss Marple? I shall knit, she replied. And perhaps listen a bit more closely to the peonies next spring. They've been awfully quiet this year. On the last Sunday of the month, the vicar announced a new bench was to be installed in the village garden. It was placed not far from the croquet lawn, beneath the shade of a chestnut tree. The plaque read, "In memory of Truth Quiet, Stubborn, and Always Watching." No name was attached, but everyone knew. They just didn't say it aloud. And that, Miss Marple thought as she passed it one morning with a fresh basket of scones, was perfectly fine. After all, truth didn't need applause. It only needed to be seen.